And here we are, back with Eduardo, and we're going to talk utilitarianism, my favorite topic. So how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine. What about you?
Good. Yeah, I am burning up. It's hot here in Wisconsin. So, and it's even hotter in this closet that I'm sitting in. I should have brought a fan in. Maybe at some point I'll actually go out and get a fan if I start sweating too much. But good. Been busy, man. Been busy. Good busy with just different projects and the family and all that sort of thing. What have you been up to?
Playing around mostly. I've been working. I've been on a couple of business trips.
Yeah.
And yeah, most of the time I was playing around, I must say, and just working. So we had a few shows in France, Spain, and I don't know. We played in Italy. We're gonna have another show this weekend.
Nice.
So yeah.
How's just the music industry in general in Europe right now? Is it sort of resuscitating after
I
all
think it is like, at least like large festivals are thriving. There's lots of huge festivals and they're all full of people. So they have a huge attendance. I don't think it will be the same for club shows though. The prospects are not so nice for club shows, but that we're gonna see that in October, I think.
Yeah, cool, man. So let us get to the topic, my friend. You had something on your mind, so why don't you lay it out and we'll see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, I think I want to have a conversation on utilitarianism. I mean, more specifically on the kind of mindset that has become so popular after the pandemic, in the sense that people feel entitled to encroach on other people's freedom for whatever reason they find. They can find some kind of utilitarian argument for, in the sense that, for example, they might say, well, it's mandatory to wear a mask because you should protect the others, right? And so who cares about your individual freedom, right? Like, even though really, on the one hand, there's not much science showing that masks do anything at all, but the principle is, even if they do like 0.1%, then you should do that. Like, to do something, so you have to do this. And it's just one of the examples that comes to my mind, because it's something that I think has changed a little bit. Like, people, I don't think people would have felt so entitled to restrict other people's freedom before the pandemic, but now it's just commonplace. Like, whatever happens, you can just say, well, just suppress this, cancel that, or forbid this meeting, forbid this kind of thing, whatever. It's like, I think the bar was set very, very low. And so
yeah, I don't know how it is over in Europe. Obviously, it sounds like it's pretty similar here. But you're absolutely right. I think the threshold for encroachment has been significantly lowered. The Overton window has shifted, definitely here in America. I mean, like, our country was kind of known for being more on the libertarian individualist side, right? And we've really seen, I think, exactly what you're talking about, right? Is people's sort of willingness to be burdened and to be restricted and be suppressed under the guise, not the reality, but the guise of some greater collective good has really shifted. It's not and it's, I don't know exactly how much it's shifted, but it has definitely shifted. And there seems to have been some priming. I don't know if any of this is intentional or not, with some of the initial suppressions that really almost seem to set people up to just be more easily disposed to accept future suppressions as well. So I don't know, maybe I'm being a little bit too skeptical or cynical, but it does seem a little convenient in certain respects, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm.
I think it does. I mean, in the sense that this COVID thing, the whole COVID thing, was a huge precedent, right? It set a very bad precedent. And I think that like, people's attitude towards other people's freedom has shifted very, like, towards the totalitarian side, in the sense that it's very easy to meddle into other people's affairs right now, because because COVID, like, you don't want other people to die. No, of course. And so you have to do what I say. I mean, of course, this is always some kind that, like, this encroachment of freedom is leaning towards a specific political directions, of course. But this is something, I mean, something I was reflecting on. Maybe, I mean, this is what I wrote to you. And it's the fact that I'm not completely like, I wouldn't discard utilitarian arguments per se, like a priori. I think you can make some kind of very, like in extreme cases, let's say to save, you have to kill one person to save 1 million lives, like some very extreme case. I think, I don't know. Again, this is some kind of utilitarian argument, and I think it would be hard to. I mean, I wouldn't argue against it. Like, if you know, if you understand what I mean, there might be some extreme cases where, okay, I understand you have to restrict other people's freedom, but it's like the standard, right? And the standard, in my, I mean, I'm fearing that this, this lowering of the bar is moving towards very dangerous directions. And one thing I was thinking of is then, if we accept, for example, the fact that everyone has to get vaccinated, and we know that some people will have some very adverse consequences, and some people will die out of it, but we still accept it because we say, okay, if we vaccinate everyone, eventually, like the impact of society of the virus will be lower. Like, granting
Right.
this, I don't think it's even true, but like, let's take this for granted.
Yeah.
What you're actually saying is that you're willing to sacrifice some people, an unspecified number of them. It can be some hundreds, some thousands. Like, if we take the virus numbers for granted and don't even take as a sub-estimate, then it's like all the orders of the tens of thousands of deaths for vaccine-induced deaths, basically. And so, where do you draw the line, basically? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
what's your opinion? I mean, would you disregard? Would you throw out a utilitarian argument per se, or do you accept that some kind of pragmatic, some kind of um, utilitarianism has to be accepted at some, maybe
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
very
So
extreme degree or something?
I'm not a utilitarian. I never have been one. I think that there's so if you go back to like Bentham and John Stuart Mill, I think it's really important to read the sort of fathers of utilitarianism. And certainly I think utility plays a role in pragmatic and moral decision making, right? But utilitarianism wants to sort of reduce all moral decision making to some sort of well, originally it's a hedonistic calculus, right? But so utilitarianism sort of develops out of hedonism. You can really think of it, the crude way of putting it is utilitarianism is just hedonism applied to the collective, right? Where there's something that is identified as the good, or some things, right? Some utilitarians want to suggest that these things can be quantified. I certainly don't think that's the case, but regardless, right? Then you have some sort of utilitarian calculus, right? The famous motto is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? And then whatever the circumstances are, you try to run it through the utilitarian calculus to figure out not just if something is morally permissible, but in certain cases whether you would be obligated to do it, right? This is sort of the general thrust of utilitarianism, of which there's many different schools. You have act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, all this sort of stuff. So I think I think it's important to just kind of talk about this generally first, so we can get to specifics. I'm not a utilitarian because I think that there's any number of truly absurd moral consequences that come out of utilitarianism. I mean, you can figure out situations where you would, under certain utilitarian frameworks, be obliged to commit horrendous acts, right, for some particular outcome, where our deepest moral intuitions say, no, that's definitely wrong, right? Some of these thought experiments are pretty crazy or absurd, but like you could imagine that. Well, I mean, actually, some of them aren't absurd. You mentioned just killing one person to save 10, right? So if you could kill one person to save 10, certain utilitarians might, or maybe it's a million, maybe it's some number. Other ethical theories, the ones that I'm drawn to, like virtue ethics and natural law, would say utility plays a role in moral decision making, but it's not the only role. There's some actions that are just intrinsically immoral, call them intrinsically evil. And it's the case that whenever you're dealing with an intrinsically evil action, it could never be justified by any utility whatsoever, right? Say like raping a young child or directly intending the murder of some innocent person, right? Now, I guess to be fair to there does seem to be sort of relevant differences between one person killing an innocent person, say, for whatever reason, to save 10 lives, right? Versus society or government saying, we're going to do this policy where it might cost, in a broad statistical sense, this many lives, but it might save us, in a broad statistical sense, these other lives, right? And the intention of the policy is not to kill anybody. That's not the intention of the policy. The intention of the policy is something else, but we just have a sort of foreseeable potential statistical consequence of that, right? You might be able to justify, I think you could justify things like that under ethical frameworks that aren't utilitarian. What you could never justify is something like, we're going to do a Holocaust on people to eradicate certain heredities or genetic dispositions. So in the long run, people are healthier, have less disease, or something like that, which is something like a utilitarianism could set you up for, right? So I don't know if that's that. I don't know if I even answered your question at that point. I just kind of returned some of your thoughts with some further.
Oh, I think you raised a host of interesting points. Like, again, talking about policies, like the thing that was puzzling me, and this is some kind of ethical problem I've been thinking for a while now, but and I think you must have thought about it too. It's something like along the lines of let's say, and this is something that came to my mind when I was thinking about the vaccine, right? Say you don't want to vaccinate, but you want to do something which is in a way it's equivalent, in the sense that you randomly choose a number of healthy persons in society, you kill them, you take their organs, and you use them to save, I don't know, like say 10 lives per person, 100 lives. Like, just imagine some kind of policy like this. I was thinking that the whole process through, right? Imagine a society that sends the police at your home and say, look, you have been chosen for this. You're gonna die like tomorrow. We need to take you home and, you know, like kill you. I think it would be horrific, right? I don't think anyone would accept this kind of thing. Like anyone when you see it framed in this way, right? When you see this the problem framed in this explicit way, in the sense that it's very direct, like you see the police coming and taking you and killing you, basically. But then I was asking myself again, if we have this many deaths by, you know, vaccine side effects, and we basically forced everyone to take the vaccine, I mean, there wasn't police coming at your place if you didn't do that, but it was close to that, because people were getting fines in Italy for not getting vaccinated and were being excluded from society. They couldn't go to work. They couldn't, you know, like you couldn't feed your family. So it was a sort of it's not exactly the same, but I mean, it's like someone is pointing again at your head gently, right?
Right.
Then
right,
a number of these persons will eventually die because of, you know, the side effects or whatever. And I really fail to see the difference, because both policies are you know, are sort of random. You don't really know who's going to have the side effects, who's going to experience them. There are healthy young persons that die all of a sudden. There's all these massive waves of athletes dying and things like that, right?
Yeah,
So
it's crazy, isn't it?
it is.
So,
And so
yeah, a few just initial thoughts on that, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm defending the vaccine policies, but I think certain ethicists would say something like this to try and justify it, right? Is that in the case of you going and harvesting somebody's organs, it is a sort of necessary part of that action that you intentionally kill somebody, right? You can't get the policy off the ground unless you intend to kill somebody, right? Whereas with the vaccine, it's sort of accidental that people die, and you're not intending that any people die. And ideally, if you had a safer vaccine, you would use it. So the difference between a sort of necessary constitutive element of the act versus an accidental one seems to play a moral difference maker and something like that. I actually like generally agree with that. I think so here's, you know, just to lay my cards on the table, I would not actually, I'm not in principle against and I say this as a very much a former libertarian type of person, but I'm not in principle against the government having power to mandate vaccination in principle. in practice against it in this instance. I think if you had, for example, a true Black Death scenario, right? Think original Black Death, 1 out of 4 people are getting wiped out by some disease. And you actually had like a generally safe or even moderately safe, effective vaccination against something like that. I think it would be morally permissible, especially, and if the vaccine was really truly effective, right?
Because you're putting in some kind of utilitarian calculus there, right? Because
there
you're
is, yeah, there definitely is, which is why I wanted to say that all utility considerations are definitely not off limits. I think we have to have utility considerations, even going back to Aristotle, right? Aristotle, when he's thinking about ethical considerations, he is thinking about outcomes, right? Outcome, like what the potential outcomes are, should go into your moral decision making. However, it's not just outcomes. You also have to think about the circumstances, the intentions, the nature of the actions, what's essential to the action, what's accidental. So Aristotle and other ethicists, they have utility considerations in ethical decision making, but they don't reduce all ethical decision making to utility considerations. And what they want to say is there's other considerations that could override utility considerations, such as truly intrinsically evil acts, right? Like intentionally saying we're going to introduce some act that it's necessary that somebody is murdered to harvest our organs. Like they're going to say, no, that can never be justified on utility. Now, if it's accidental that certain people may die, and we know that statistically, but if we could prevent that through increased technology or whatever, we would prevent that and still get the effect we want. It might be
yes,
the case
but
that it's permissible.
It's just, I mean, I see this as a way, it's like just a different phrasing of the issue, because then you could say, well, if you could, for example, instead of, I mean, we don't mean to kill people. Let's say you just shoot a gun randomly and then you hit someone, and then that guy is the one that you will harvest the organs. Like someone goes in the street,
right?
some
But
policeman
it's
or whatever.
still essential that somebody is killed, right? That's
yes, but
that's the point of the act. Yeah.
With the vaccines, for example, you already know that someone will get killed for sure. For sure. I mean, you could say if we had a technology in which we could produce organs, for example, in a biotech lab, then we wouldn't kill anyone. So we do this as long as we don't have this technology, which is, in a way, it's very, I see there's a parallel with your argument when you say we don't really intend to kill people. It's just the best thing we have. And so we do this, right? And we know that there are some negative side effects to this policy, and we would try to minimize them. And I would say, like the same thing you could say with the kind of organ harvesting policy, in the sense that you could say, look, we can try out of a person, like last year we could save 10 persons, now we can save 100, which means we only have to kill one every, I don't know, like making up some numbers, right?
Yeah, so I would just reemphasize the point in the organ harvesting. Even if you're not intending to kill any particular person, it's still essential that you murder an innocent person to get their organs. It's not essential to vaccination that any person die. Ideally, we would have it so nobody dies, right? It's accidental, and even though we can see statistically, given the situation, that some people will die, that's not necessary to what vaccination is trying to achieve. Right. Here's a parallel that is another related hot topic that's kind of, I think, maps on to what we're saying. Think of abortion, right? So many people, including myself, think abortion is intrinsically immoral, can never be justified because it's intentionally killing an innocent human being, right? Now, whatever somebody's thoughts on abortion, just entertain the thought experiment for a minute, right? But then what do you do about something like an ectopic pregnancy, right? An ectopic pregnancy, if people want the details about that, they can look it up. But they wonder if this is abortion. Well, what happens with various ethicists, the way that this is handled is you can sort of remove the issue from the woman without intentionally or directly killing the child, even though you know the child will die. And that's not an abortion. And ideally, if we had the technology, we could still save the child, right? So there's this doctrine of double effect where abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent person, right? And this is why if the person doesn't die, we say we have a botched or failed abortion, right? Whereas if you remove, say, a part of the woman because something's gone wrong with the pregnancy without intentionally killing the fetus, but even if you know, just because given the limits of technology, the fetus will die, it's a morally different situation that can be permissible, especially if the woman's life is in danger, because it's not essential that the fetus die for that action to occur. It's accidental. Now, ideally, we at some point will have the technology, right, that we could save both. But in hard situations like that, what's kind of doing the moral work here is what is either essential or accidental to a particular action. This is in the, for people who want to know the sort of ethical theory at work here, it's really sort of natural law action theory. And so you put me in a somewhat awkward spot, because it seems like I'm defending these COVID policies. I'm not, I'm really not. I don't think
no.
that,
I think it's interesting, that this is the, I think it's an interesting conversation, because the important thing is to get to the root of the problem, right? And see and highlight where things come from and where can you go, how long can you go along certain lines when you take a path and you take some kind of worldview, right?
right.
And I think it's more, I mean, I don't care about COVID policies per se. I think it's just something, as we started, it's something emblematic of our times, and it's something that, like, lowered the bar. And this is why I'm worried about it.
Right.
It's not the policy per se. It's, it's the whole environment around it. And so it's the whole way of thinking that is, like the mentality of the population that has shifted towards more kind of totalitarian ways. And so again, this is something I was thinking out of this, then what are the consequences of this line of thinking? What if we just, again, it's just reasoning on purely utilitarian terms, so we have to save lives no matter what.
Yeah, and clearly that's that isn't going to work, right? Because I think if you just say that, you're going to run into these morally absurd consequences. But there's a lot of sort of area in the middle, like mandatory vaccines and stuff like that. My general case against the mandatory vaccination is, I think generally in society, unless you, and maybe COVID qualified as this at first, right? Because when it comes to imposing burdens on society, I think a good general moral rule is those who impose burdens have the burden of proof, for one thing. And the bigger burden that you are attempting to impose, assuming that it is something that could be morally permissible to impose it, the larger your burden of proof is. Now, this gets tricky because if we think the government actually has legitimate authority and coercive power, one of the reasons we think the government has that or should have that is because sometimes you need to make snap decisions in hot situations, right? So it can't be the case, right? It can't be the case for any authority that they have to like always reasonably establish their burden through whatever means, philosophical or scientific, before that burden is imposed. Otherwise, you would have too much inefficiency. Nothing could ever get done, right? So I think of a natural disaster or something like that. Like you're forcing people to move out of an area, and people are skeptical, and you've got to demonstrate scientifically that would surely be unreasonable, right? To think that had to like be met initially. But not all situations are like that. And I think that we learned enough. I think with COVID, the situation was something like, I don't know, I go back and forth on this, honestly, Eduardo. Like part of me thinks that maybe the first wave of suppressions might have been morally justified because there was a lot of unknowns, right? There was a lot of unknowns. So think of the 2 weeks to flatten the curve that turned into like 7 years of mandates and passports and all this stuff, right? So you got to see where I'm going with it, right? So I think, given the unknowns, okay, authority has this sort of power to temporarily make some, to suppress certain but not all rights and liberties, certain but not rights and liberties for society as a whole. Maybe that was justified at the initial sort of COVID outset because of how much was unknown. But I want to say we pretty quickly learned a lot of important things that would have immediately shifted that burden of proof onto the coercive authorities, and that burden of proof was never met at all, even close. And the ongoing imposition, especially of lockdowns, I'm most skeptical of lockdowns and suppressing people's really very fundamental right to make a living, right? And this is the thing: is when you talk about rights, certain rights are certainly I don't think all rights are absolute. I think rights can be limited and can be restricted, right? But some rights are absolute or very close to it, meaning that it's going to be hard to make a case that you could ever suppress it, such as a right to make a living, a right to provide for yourself. Because if you start to suppress that right, you're really kind of suppressing the right to life, which is surely not something that you can suppress or limit, right? So if you're going to restrict somebody's right to make a living for themselves, it better be um, an incredible situation, and it better be for a very short amount of time, right? And there better be something else that I don't know, can be done for those people, hopefully, which wasn't the case. So that's what I would kind of say, like initially, I guess, about a lot of different things. I would I guess add as well in terms of speaking of burden of proof and utility. All the decisions that were made about lockdowns did seem to like suddenly fly in the face and go the opposite direction of pretty much everything we knew, right? Um, in the medical community about lockdowns and how viruses spread. So that was a little bit weird. But I'm trying to be like as generous as I can to the opposite position. And then I want to say the same thing about vaccines. I want to say at the end of the day, given what we know about vaccines and what we know about reducing transmission or lack thereof, right? Who's actually susceptible to the virus versus who isn't, certain ages, other comorbidities and stuff like that. I just don't think the case is there to require mandatory vaccination in this instance. So it's a sort of in practice objection that I have, not necessarily an in principle one where the burden of proof hasn't been met. And if it is this low, and this is I think the point that you're saying, if it is this low to essentially force people to take something into their body that might not want to, if the standard is this low for this level of encroachment or infringement, this is your concern, Eduardo, I think we've opened the floodgates at this point, right? So I want to say, like, in principle, this could be done, but we have to have a very high threshold or barrier to entry for something like this to occur. Otherwise, we're just going to be right on the road to totalitarianism and collectivisms. And I think that's probably your primary concern, and I agree with that. I totally agree with that. Right. Mm-hmm.
And my other concern, and I think it's sort of another utilitarian argument that I'm making here, because okay, let's say that you set a very high threshold, right? And you say, as you said, and as most people say, even people that do not agree with lockdowns, they say, okay, well, maybe the first 2 weeks we are right to do that because we didn't know, right? But then seeing what happened afterwards, like no government on earth, probably like a couple of states in the US, like Florida most notably, but I don't think anyone in Europe like went back, right? Like they never admitted that it wasn't necessary to do a lockdown. They doubled down. Pretty much everyone doubled down on this policy. No one really admitted that lockdowns were useless, even though we knew by April 2020, May 2020, we knew that because there were states that were knocking down and the curve was going the other direction. And so my question is, my concern is, at this point, if you know that even if you set a very high threshold, right, and you're granting some rights to the government to do something to you, like limiting your liberty in a very fundamental way, how do you know they're going to give it back? They didn't, even though the evidence was there. And so why should I give up at all in the first place? I mean, this was, again, I also come from some kind of libertarian positions. And I remember that when the pandemic started, my thought was, all right, I mean, we clearly need the government to set things straight. I mean, like, people by themselves, they couldn't handle this at all. I mean, we need to flatten the curve. I believe the mathematical models and so on. And so I said, okay, this is a clear cut, it's a very clear case for government intervention in a very strong way. And now I'm completely out of the other direction, because the government is, and I think by nature, politicians.
Because you're a man of reason.
Yeah, but they're incapable of admitting, or that it's very, very hard, for them to admit that they failed and they shouldn't have done that. Even for scientists, in the first place, I think the scientists failed us more than politicians. I mean, I'm not so surprised that politicians failed us. Yeah. I'm not.
So I agree with all of that. I think that there's certain things that Prudence, right? Prudence is sort of the chariot virtue, according to Aristotle, right? And prudence sort of has three faces. It looks to the past. What have we learned in the past using past experience, to looking towards the future for the sort of good life that we want, but also a face looking presently now to the decision we have to make, right? We know a lot of things about modern political society. We know, for example, that once governments tend to suppress certain rights, they almost never unsuppress them, right? Very rarely. Governments do tend to get bigger and more coercive, generally not smaller. There are exceptions that have gone in the other direction, right? Even apart from revolution and stuff like that. And that everything that you said is absolutely correct in terms of the government trying and certain political parties trying to expand their power. They will often do it under the guise of what appears to be expert testimonial. But that's all that it really is, right? It's just a mirage, right? At the end of the day, right? And people cooking up these absolutely fanciful, spectacularly failed models to push through some type of political policy or expansion. And here I want to just say it's an utter lack of prudence for people who have just not paid attention to the history of failures, and I wouldn't want to say intentional deceptions that have gone on, especially in, I mean, I'm going to go on a little bit of rant here, but especially with science. I mean, scientists are like the modern day priestly class, right? It is, if you're a politician and you want to make it seem like you're sophisticated and you know what's up, you're going to say that you're on team science, right? The scientists agree with it. And if you're not on team science, you're going to pay the money that you need to get science on your team, right? That's just how it works, right? This is how it's always worked. Unfortunately, right? I'm a fan of science. Science is great, but it's also in many ways obscenely corrupt, highly susceptible to groupthink, social pressures, money, all of that. And if
Again,
somebody,
I would argue that's not science. That's scientists, right?
Right. Yeah. Sure.
Like
Yeah. Fair enough.
science
Yeah,
is a method.
fair.
It's
Right.
but yeah, I agree with you. It's I don't know. So what should we do? So I mean, what are the conclusions? I mean, what are the bottom lines here? Because there's again, they're all sort of valid arguments for not excluding government intervention per se in these kind of extreme situations with extreme measures. But then how do you limit that? How do you ensure that the cure is not, on the long run, then the cure is worse than the disease? Because that's what happened with COVID. Right now we are facing all the economic side effects, and I don't know, people just like to pretend that it's due to Ukraine crisis, which might be to some small extent probably in Europe because we depend on Russian gas, but that's it.
Yeah.
Everything else was starting to look pretty bad already before that. And never mind all the social discrimination we faced here towards non-vaccinated, and I was vaccinated, but I was discriminated as well because I refused to take a booster shot. So
you didn't take 12 of them, right?
Mm-hmm. I didn't. Yeah, some kind of ridiculous thing, and again, out of utilitarianism, I would say it's close to impossible now. I would accept any kind of a strong policy mandated by the government, such as the ones we had before, because they lowered the bar, but from my side, the bar was raised by a lot. I think like the main thing is that pretty much, again, as I said before, nowhere in the world anyone had the guts to say, "Look, we are wrong.
Right.
This wasn't necessary. All this suffering wasn't necessary." And until anyone is going to admit that, and it's
yeah, but people aren't generally as dumb as they look, to say something a little snarky, because I mean, it seems like people's overall trust in these various institutions has dropped, at least in America. I don't know what it is in Europe.
Same thing over here. Same thing over here.
So I want to say this is a really bad situation overall, because to sort of function as humans and certainly as a society, we do actually need trustworthy institutions and experts and authority, right? I mean, like, so much of what we depend on comes from institutions and authority and testimony, scientific knowledge, right? Shoot, I only know my name and where I was born because of the testimony of my parents and on authority and stuff like that. Like, so much of our basic knowledge depends on testimony being at least generally reliable, institutions being generally reliable. And we've got this horrible situation where you said, the cure is worse than disease. I mean, it really is, especially when you think about the lockdowns. I think the best data we have now shows that they did virtually nothing in terms of what they were supposed to do in terms of benefits, and have cost us absolutely incalculable damage that we're probably not even going to know the full extent of, I don't, for however many years to come, right? I mean, we're now still suffering some of the economic catastrophes, the mental health catastrophes, the missed medical diagnoses, like the missed vaccines of for other diseases, right? It's enormous, and like how you even can begin to calculate it, I have no idea. And part of my fear is that people will kind of ignore it because there's incentive to ignore it, like you said, right? The people who are in power here don't have any incentive to go back and admit that they made an enormous mistake and to calculate what the costs of those mistakes were. They have every incentive to continue doubling down, which is what they have done. So the problem is that I think they're
It's also
already,
from the,
yeah,
sorry, but it's also from the people's side. I mean, if you wasted years of your life in lockdown believing these policies, there's no way you're gonna believe, like, you're gonna defend that. It's some kind of Stockholm syndrome. There's a sunk cost bias, right? And so people will, and that's what happens when you argue about these things, that people, now it's pretty much clear that, these waves come and go no matter what you do, because that's what's happening since we removed the restrictions and the virus has changed. And if anything is more infectious, which means if the expansion, this expansion is unlimited, then we should see more of it. But we've seen exactly the same dynamics in terms of going up and
right.
down. So, but people don't admit it. They
Yeah,
need to find a cause.
and you're right. The gymnastics people will go through to justify the impositions because they went along with them is truly collective Stockholm syndrome. It really is. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. But the other part of it is a problem too. Is like before, people like us, who I would say were sort of reasonably skeptical of government impositions, but not like entirely cynical, right? Like we both were willing to admit that, hey, early on, it seems like maybe this would have been morally permissible. Well, now seeing how we've just been totally played, right? Now our skepticism is way higher, right? But that's not a good thing either. I mean, it might be a good thing if we're dealing with systematically dishonest people, which I think we are, right? I think you should be more skeptical of systematically dishonest people. But again, this is really bad for society as a whole that needs to function with a reasonable trust in experts and authority. So you asked me what the solution is. I have no idea. I just see continued turbulence and breakdown. I think we're in a really bad situation overall. The systematic dishonesty, the corruption, the failed policies, the doubling down, the economic catastrophes, the mental health catastrophes, the Stockholm syndrome of certain parties, and the increased skepticism of other parties. How do you fix that? I have no idea, man. I have no idea. Yeah. I'm not too optimistic.
Me neither.
How about you? How do you fix it?
I have no idea. I don't know, because like conspiracy theorists were right most of the time, and this is something I've been fighting, I mean, all my life, but I've been fighting on their side for the last year or so. And so I don't know. I mean, I have zero trust in anything the government would say, anything at this point. So
right, which might cause you to be skeptical of something that actually that maybe you shouldn't be skeptical of, because you're dealing with systematic, and it's classic boy who cried wolf type of stuff, right? That's what it is. But you're still warranted in that skepticism because you're dealing with systematically dishonest people, and that's exactly the problem. And I'm with you, man. I'm extremely skeptical of any policies that the current government proposes, not just because of how they couldn't have been more wrong about most of the policies. It's not that they were just like a little bit off. It's that they were as off as you could possibly be about their predictions, right? I mean, like we talk about science, being judged by its ability to make accurate predictions, how much more falsification could you possibly need against something like lockdowns, right? So they couldn't have been more wrong, but they failed to admit their mistakes. They continually doubled down, and they kept pushing even further impositions, some more ridiculous than others admitted. I'm with you. I think masks were unjustified as well. And I think in this case, so were the mandatory vaccinations, and discrimination against the vaccinated made no sense. The best proposals I saw were those by like the Great Barrington Declaration of Focus Protection and stuff like that. And I don't have, I guess, any particular issue with the vaccine itself. I just think that for a lot of people, especially, people like me who've already had the thing, the disease that shall not be named, right? It just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? And especially since I know a number of people who have suffered quite seriously from been legitimately crippled by the vaccine, who are otherwise healthy people, that there are costs to it, and that these costs need to be admitted. How severe they are is another story, but there are costs to it. And the fact that that wasn't even allowed to be in the conversation, again, just raises skepticism, right? And all this is just really bad public policy, right? You would think that the best way to get people to know you, like you, and trust you as a public policy expert is just not to systematically lie to them, right? This is bad long-term policy. Because then, if you just train people to be skeptical of public policy experts, which we're doing right now, and then eventually something comes along where you need people to not be so skeptical, you're going to be in a bad situation. So I don't know. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but
yeah. I think we raised a few interesting points. Maybe we can wrap up here, and I'm not sure we're going to end up to any meaningful conclusion, but I think the conversation was interesting, so it was worth discussing all this stuff after it's been a few months, right?
It has been, yeah. At least we talked music recently, but we haven't talked any of the worldly events in a while. Mm-hmm. And I'm in. So unlike you, I'm in Wisconsin. So our state, we had the initial this sort of initial lockdown, the short-term lockdown, but then after that, Wisconsin was really freed up. And surprisingly, Eduardo, I'm not walking over corpses constantly when I step outside. It's
because you're amazing. Lying.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
You must be like, oh, it's either you're not walking or you're lying. These are the two options.
Yeah. So I've so I've observed the madness kind of through the internet, but at least here in my home state, I really haven't had to live it that much. I mean, we had some masking nonsense for a little bit, but even that got lifted by the Supreme Court here pretty early on. So then, some businesses required it. It's fine. I just didn't go into those businesses. So yeah, I see it going on all around and hear the stories that you have to tell. But fortunately, we really haven't had to deal with it personally too much.
Yeah, I feel they're putting it on pause here. They're pausing it for the summer, and then they're ready to come back at us as soon as they can. So I don't know.
So yeah,
it's nice talking to you. Anyway.
So people have a right to be skeptical. I think if you aren't skeptical at this point, you just haven't been paying attention. Pure utilitarianism, I think, is a sort of bogus theory. If people want to just read some interesting stuff on it, just Google utility monsters. There's all sorts of utility monster thought experiments that just reduce utilitarianism to the absurd. But I think it is worth reading some interesting utilitarians like Peter Singer, and seeing how far they're willing to go in their moral theory, like to some really absurd types of consequences, if people want to just go further in that. But you're right. I mean, a lot of how society operates is just according to a sort of crude utilitarianism. So I think that is part of the problem. It's just sort of the part of the modern philosophical package. Yeah.
Cool. So
you want to mention anything before we shut this one off?
No, I think it's fine. Come on.
Check out Nanowar of Steel.
I got Nanowar of Steel, so if anything, you can check them out, or that's it pretty much at the moment.
Cool.
I don't have any other projects in place apart from my job. So thanks for the conversation. It was really nice.
As always, and for the gentle listeners, if you dig this sort of thing, please like it, share it, send me an email, let me know what you want to hear next time, and we will catch you then. Peace.